A little beggar gave his only food to a millionaire who was crying in the street. What he said next? The wind sliced through the streets of Manhattan like invisible blades, whistling between towering skyscrapers and rattling the bones of those without shelter. Among the endless waves of rushing legs and honking taxis, a small boy stood nearly motionless at the corner of East 42nd Street, gripping a dented paper cup in his red, trembling hands. His name was Eli Thompson. He was 10 years old, though his small frame and sunken cheeks made him look younger. In the eyes of most, he didn't exist. He was another face in the blur of a city that never slowed down, an invisible fixture of the sidewalk. Eli had been alone for nearly 2 years now, ever since a fire tore through the modest apartment in the Bronx where his parents had lived and died. He didn't remember the flames so much as the smell, acrid, black smoke that clung to his clothes for weeks afterward. The system tried to help, placing him in temporary shelters and foster homes, but nothing ever lasted. He slipped through the cracks as easily as rain down a gutter. Each morning, Eli followed the same route. He left the shelter at dawn, bundled in 2 worn sweaters, a threadbare jacket, and mismatched gloves. He'd stop near Grand Central, sometimes venturing down to the subways where he found generous volunteers handing out small breakfasts to the homeless. Most days, he was lucky enough to get a sandwich or a banana. If he didn't, he'd scavenge, or go without. But it wasn't just hunger that gnawed at him. It was the silence. The way people looked past him, through him, as if he were a ghost haunting the edges of their day. They saw the dirt on his face, the holes in his shoes, and assumed the worst, until he was no longer even worth a second glance. He didn't beg aggressively. He didn't know how. Instead, he held out his cup quietly and hoped someone would notice. Once in a while, a kind soul would drop a coin or two. Rarely $1. But mostly, it was nothing. Just cold wind and footsteps. That particular morning had begun like all the others. Eli had managed to get a half-stale ham sandwich from a subway volunteer. He held onto it like treasure, tucking it carefully into his coat. It was the only meal he'd likely get until nightfall. Still, he kept moving, drifting toward Park Avenue, drawn by habit more than hope. That was when he saw something unusual. Just ahead, seated on the curb in front of a high-rise bank building, was a man in a gray suit. Not just any suit, it looked expensive, the kind Eli had only seen on billboards or the covers of newspapers left behind on benches. The man's shoes were polished, his briefcase lay open beside him, and his head was bowed low, cradled in both hands. Eli slowed his steps. At first, he thought the man was sick. Then he noticed the shaking of his shoulders. Not from cold. From something else. The man was crying. It wasn't the loud sobbing Eli sometimes heard from others on the street. It was quiet. Contained. The kind of crying a person does when they're trying not to be seen. When they're trying to keep something broken from spilling all over the sidewalk. Eli stopped. Dozens of people passed by, each one glancing briefly at the man in the suit before walking faster, pretending not to see him. No one stopped. No one asked if he was okay. The contradiction struck Eli. How could someone dressed like that, someone who clearly had money, maybe even power, be sitting alone and crying in the cold? The boy stood there, unsure. His instincts told him to move on. To avoid attention. But something in the man's posture felt familiar. The way his shoulders curled in. The way his hands gripped his hair like he was holding on to the last thread of himself. Eli had looked like that once, on the night he realized no one was coming for him. Without fully understanding why, he stepped closer. He clutched the sandwich tighter in one hand, still unsure what to say or do. Then, in the simplest act of instinct and empathy, Eli did something extraordinary. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the sandwich, the only food he had for the entire day, and knelt quietly beside the man. He didn't speak right away. He just offered the sandwich, holding it out like a peace offering between two strangers who had nothing left. That moment, unnoticed by the crowd, was about to change both of their lives forever. The man didn't notice the boy at first. His eyes were pressed tightly shut, his breath shallow and uneven, caught somewhere between restraint and collapse. His body language was rigid, but not with pride, more like a building barely holding itself together after a storm. Eli remained still, crouching just beside him, arm extended, sandwich in hand. After a long moment, the man finally sensed someone's presence. His head lifted slightly, and his tear-streaked face turned toward Eli. He was middle-aged, probably in his late 40s, with salt and pepper stubble on his chin and lines under his eyes that suggested many sleepless nights. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and despite the elegance of his clothing, there was a wild disarray to his appearance, like he had stopped caring somewhere along the way. Eli didn't flinch under the man's gaze. His eyes, large and quiet, held no judgment, only concern. "What?" the man muttered hoarsely. His voice was cracked, like it hadn't been used in hours. "What are you doing?" "You look like you need it more than I do," Eli replied simply. The man blinked, confused. He stared at the sandwich, nothing fancy, just 2 slices of white bread, a piece of ham, and a smear of mustard wrapped in cheap wax paper, and then back at the boy's face. "I'm fine," he said automatically, though his voice lacked conviction. Eli didn't lower his arm. "You don't look fine." There was no sarcasm in the boy's tone, only observation. He was too young to be patronizing and too honest to pretend. The man looked around, as if checking whether anyone else was watching. But the people kept walking, blind as always. "You don't have to take it," Eli added, lowering the sandwich just slightly. "But you should eat something." The man let out a faint, humorless laugh. "A 10-year-old is telling me how to take care of myself. That's new." "I'm not telling you what to do," Eli said. "Just offering." That word, offering, hung in the air. It was strange, the way it cut through the noise and the cold, through the ache in the man's chest. No one had offered him anything all day. No warmth, no help, no eye contact. People had stared at him the same way they stared at subway graffiti, distant and mildly annoyed. He looked at the sandwich again, then at Eli's hands. They were small, red with cold, and cracked along the knuckles. "Is that all you have?" the man asked. Eli shrugged. "Yeah. And you're giving it to me? You look hungrier." The word struck like a hammer, not because the man was physically hungry, though he hadn't eaten since the night before, but because of the weight behind them. There was a time, not long ago, when he was the one giving, when he could sign checks with 5 zeros and sponsor entire fundraising galas without blinking. Now, he couldn't even look his daughter in the eye. He took the sandwich slowly, as if it might vanish if he moved too fast. "Thanks," he said, barely above a whisper. They sat in silence for a minute. Eli didn't get up, didn't hurry off to the next block. He just sat beside the man like he was used to being near sadness. He was. The man finally spoke again. "My name's Nathaniel. Nathaniel Ross." Eli nodded. "I'm Eli." Nathaniel glanced down at the sandwich in his hands, then back at Eli. "Do you even know who I am?" "No. You've never seen me before? On TV, or online?" Eli shook his head. "I don't have a phone. And the shelter's TV's been broken for weeks." That answer caught Nathaniel off guard. It reminded him how far removed this boy's life was from his own. Or at least, from the life he used to have. "I used to be someone important," Nathaniel said slowly, the bitterness in his voice rising. "CEO of a firm called Ross and Danton. We managed billions in investments. I was everywhere. News, magazines, interviews. All of it." Eli said nothing. He had no reaction because he had no context. Money didn't impress him, fame meant little. To him, people were people. Some were kind. Some weren't. Nathaniel continued, "I built everything from scratch. No inheritance, no shortcuts. Just years of work. I used to think I had everything figured out. But this week, it all fell apart. Eli didn't ask what happened. He sensed the man needed to speak, and sometimes, silence was better than questions. Nathaniel's voice dropped. One bad decision. One. I trusted the wrong person with our accounts. The media went insane. Accusations, lawsuits, investors pulling out. The company's gone. Just like that. And then, my wife, she told me she needed space. My daughter won't speak to me. His throat tightened. It's not even the money. It's like I became a stranger to everyone I care about. Like none of it mattered. Eli listened without flinching. To him, abandonment wasn't a concept. It was a memory. The day his parents were taken, he felt the same kind of erasure, sudden, cruel, and absolute. Do you know what the worst part is? Nathaniel asked, his tone almost angry. They say men like me are strong. Leaders. Resilient. But I sat in my car for over an hour this morning and couldn't even start the engine. I was afraid of the day. Eli's voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. It's okay to be afraid. Nathaniel exhaled, some of the tension in his shoulders unraveling. How old are you? 10. And where are your parents? Gone, Eli replied plainly. There was a fire. A long time ago. Nathaniel closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Eli shrugged again. You get used to missing people. That sentence, so casually said, cut Nathaniel deeper than any article written about his fall. He turned to look at the boy fully for the first time, not as a stranger or a curiosity, but as someone real, someone who understood what most adults never could. He took a bite of the sandwich. It was dry, a little stale. But to Nathaniel, it tasted like survival. They sat there for a while longer. The sun was climbing now, spreading gold across the tops of the buildings, but the chill still lingered in the shadowed streets. Nathaniel didn't know what he would do next. He had no plan. But for the first time in days, the weight pressing on his chest had lessened, just a little. I don't know what to say, he muttered, eyes still on the boy. You don't have to say anything, Eli said. Just don't forget. Forget what? That someone stopped. Nathaniel looked at him again, and in that moment, the man who had built and lost an empire was the one learning something from a child who had nothing. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple exchange, one sandwich, one moment of unexpected kindness, would echo far beyond that morning. And neither of them would ever be the same. The city had begun to awaken in earnest. Taxis zipped past in hurried lines, coffee carts steamed on corners, and the cold morning air filled with the rhythmic sound of dress shoes and high heels striking the pavement. Park Avenue resumed its performance of wealth and ambition, but in a quiet corner of the sidewalk, something unusual persisted, a conversation that refused to conform to the rhythm of the day. Nathaniel finished the last bite of the sandwich slowly. He wasn't used to eating like that, hunched over, no napkin, no fine plate, but something about the simplicity of it, and the humility required to accept it, made it feel almost sacred. He wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his suit jacket and looked back at Eli, who now sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, hands buried deep in his sleeves. I haven't talked to anyone like this in a long time, Nathaniel admitted, voice softer than before. Eli didn't respond right away. His eyes were on the sidewalk, following the cracks and the gum stains like a secret map only he could see. People only talk to me when they want something, the man added, glancing down at his scuffed shoes. Or when they're being paid to pretend they care. Eli tilted his head slightly. I didn't want anything. I know, Nathaniel said. That's what makes it feel real. A long silence settled between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that lets thoughts float freely, that doesn't demand words but allows them when they're ready. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a weathered wallet. He opened it, stared inside for a few seconds, then pulled out a folded business card. I don't know what your life looks like, he said carefully, but I know mine's about to change. A lot. I don't even know where I'm sleeping tonight. but if I ever get back on my feet, or even just figure out what I'm doing, I want you to have this." Eli blinked, uncertain. "It's just a card," Nathaniel continued, holding it out. "With my name and number. Don't expect miracles. Just, if you ever want to learn something, study, maybe, I can try to help." The boy took the card slowly, examining it like a foreign object. His fingers traced the embossed lettering, Nathaniel Ross, founder, Ross and Danton. The title felt ghostly now, like a shadow of something no longer real. "I don't know if I'll ever call," Eli said honestly. Nathaniel nodded. "That's okay. You don't have to. People give me stuff sometimes," the boy added, turning the card over. "But they usually don't mean it." His tone wasn't accusatory. It was simply factual, the voice of someone who had learned through repetition that promises usually dissolve before they reached him. "I'm not making a promise," Nathaniel said. "I'm making a possibility." Eli tucked the card into his jacket. "Okay." Then, for the first time since their meeting, Nathaniel smiled, just a flicker, not wide or confident, but real. Eli noticed, but didn't smile back. He wasn't ready for that kind of trust. Not yet. A breeze passed between them, sweeping along the sidewalk and tugging at the hem of Nathaniel's coat. He shivered, more from exhaustion than from the cold. "Where will you go now?" Eli asked. Nathaniel looked toward the corner, where the gleaming towers of Midtown loomed like indifferent sentinels. "I don't know. I might disappear for a while." "That's what I did," Eli said quietly. "After the fire. I disappeared. People forget faster that way." Nathaniel didn't know how to answer that. There was too much truth in the words, and too much pain behind them. Instead, he reached into his wallet again and took out a $20 bill, creased, but clean. "Here," he said, holding it toward Eli. "Buy yourself something warm." The boy hesitated. His eyes scanned the man's face carefully, reading him the way only someone used to surviving could. After a pause, he took the bill and nodded once. There was no "thank you," but Nathaniel didn't expect one. The exchange wasn't about gratitude. It was about dignity. Eli stood. His legs were stiff, and he brushed the dust from the knees of his pants out of habit, though they were already stained beyond repair. He looked down at Nathaniel, who remained seated, now hugging his briefcase to his side like it held the last piece of himself worth protecting. "You're not the only one who lost something," Eli said before turning to leave. Nathaniel watched him go, his small figure disappearing into the moving crowd like a drop of ink into water. The city swallowed him quickly. For a few seconds, Nathaniel sat frozen, unsure if any of it had actually happened. But when he reached into his coat pocket, he felt the absence of the sandwich, and the fullness of something else in its place. He stood slowly, brushing off his pants. His legs ached. His chest still felt heavy. But for the first time in days, there was a thin thread of clarity in his thoughts. Across the street, an electronic billboard scrolled headlines: "Stocks crashing, political scandals," a photo of his own face under the bold caption, "Ross resigns amidst financial chaos." He turned away. That wasn't who he was anymore. And maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. He walked without direction, his steps slow, like someone learning to move again after a long illness. As he turned the corner toward Lexington, a faint voice echoed in his memory. "You look hungrier than me." The line had been simple. But it clung to him. He hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, but it wasn't the sandwich that satisfied him. It was the offering. The boy who had nothing had seen him, not his money, not his downfall, but the part of him that was breaking. Nathaniel kept walking. He didn't know it yet, but that morning on Park Avenue would mark the beginning of a long unraveling, a process of loss, reckoning, and unexpected redemption. And somewhere, a boy named Eli carried a business card in his pocket, not because he believed in it, but because, just maybe, it was different this time. The door of the elevator opened to a floor that once bore Nathaniel Ross's name in gold. Now, it was a battlefield of moving boxes, unplugged monitors, and nervous employees packing their careers into cardboard. No one greeted him when he stepped out. Some glanced up and quickly looked away. Others paused, unsure whether to approach him or pretend not to notice. The office he had built from scratch, Ross and Danton, once a pillar of investment confidence, was in the final stages of disintegration. It didn't feel like his anymore. Not since the press had descended like vultures, not since the SEC froze their accounts, and certainly not since his co-founder had vanished to Europe the moment things unraveled. Nathaniel walked through the maze of half-empty cubicles, avoiding eye contact. Every desk was a reminder of someone he had hired, mentored, or fought for. Now, they all stood as markers of the lives disrupted by his decisions. When he reached his office door, the nameplate was already gone. Just the faint outline of adhesive remained on the glass. Inside, the space was stripped bare. The bookshelves were empty. The walls that once displayed awards and framed photos of milestone events were blank. A single banker's box sat on the floor next to his desk, containing the remnants of a life that no longer existed. He sat in his chair, and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window. Midtown spread before him, alive and ruthless. In this city, power was borrowed, not owned. Respect came with numbers. And forgiveness was rare. The fall had not come overnight. The signs were there, unanswered questions in quarterly meetings, odd delays in transactions, inconsistencies in partner reports. But Nathaniel had ignored them. He had trusted the system he helped build. And worse, he had trusted Andrew Danton. A knock came at the door, hesitant. It was Claire, his former executive assistant. She stepped inside with a clipboard in hand, her expression caught between sympathy and professionalism. "They're asking if you're ready for the transfer of authority forms," she said. "The new receivers are here." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I'll sign whatever they need." Claire hesitated. "There's something else. The Times is downstairs. They're hoping to get a statement." He let out a dry laugh. "Let them wait. Or tell them I forgot how to speak." She didn't smile. Instead, she stepped forward and set the clipboard gently on the desk. "For what it's worth, I don't think this was all your fault." He didn't answer. Guilt was no longer something he debated. It sat with him, constant and heavy, like an old coat he no longer tried to take off. After she left, Nathaniel picked up the pen and began signing. His hand trembled with each stroke. These weren't just papers, they were goodbyes. To power. To identity. To the man the world used to see when they said his name. He stayed in the office longer than necessary. He walked the halls one last time, nodding at those who still remained, avoiding the eyes of those who couldn't hide their disappointment. It wasn't just a financial failure. It was personal. He had made himself the face of the company. Now he was the symbol of its ruin. That afternoon, he left without ceremony. No speech. No farewell gathering. Just silence. He walked through the city like a ghost in an expensive suit, blending into the crowd. Somewhere along the way, he took off his tie and stuffed it into his pocket. The streets of Manhattan didn't feel like his kingdom anymore. They felt like strangers, bigger, colder, indifferent. The tabloids had already written his fall. Titan topples in Midtown, one headline had declared. Another, Ross and Danton, from billions to ashes. Even financial news sites that once praised his vision now picked apart every mistake, every missed signal, every suspicious transaction. He read none of them. What haunted him more were the conversations behind closed doors, investors whose savings were tied to the firm, employees whose health benefits were now suspended, clients who had believed in him. Every one of them felt like a stone in his chest. When evening came, Nathaniel found himself in a part of the city he rarely visited. Not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded him of the beginning, gritty, loud, unfiltered. This was the New York he had fought to rise above. Now, it was where he sought anonymity. He entered a diner with flickering lights and chipped countertops. It smelled like grease and stale coffee. He ordered nothing, just sat in a booth at the back, head low. The waitress gave him a look, half suspicion, half pity, but said nothing. For hours, he sat there, replaying the decisions that led to this. How he had doubled down when he should have investigated. How he ignored his gut. How he believed in Andrew more than in the numbers. But what he couldn't stop thinking about, what he kept returning to, was the boy. Eli. A child with nothing. A child who had noticed him when no one else did. A child who had offered him his only food. The image of that sandwich in a small, chapped hand kept breaking through the noise in Nathaniel's mind. It was absurd, and yet it grounded him. Because if a boy like that could survive what life had thrown at him and still offer something, then maybe, just maybe, Nathaniel could survive too. He pulled the 20 from his wallet and set it on the table, even though he hadn't touched a thing. Then he walked back into the night, more aimless than before, but not entirely without direction. By the time he reached the steps of a rundown hotel on the edge of the city, he was exhausted. He paid cash for a single night. No ID. No questions. In the dim room with peeling wallpaper and a broken television, Nathaniel sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the blank wall ahead. He had nothing left. No company. No reputation. No family speaking to him. His phone buzzed occasionally, messages from reporters, lawyers, former colleagues, but he didn't answer. He reached into his jacket pocket and found, to his surprise, the wax paper from the sandwich. He hadn't thrown it away. He unfolded it gently, smoothing the creases with his palm. There was nothing special about it, no note, no signature, but it felt like the only thing that mattered. That night, he slept for the first time in 4 days. Not because anything was better, but because something had reminded him that not everything was lost. And somewhere, in the heart of the city, a boy still carried his business card, unknowing, perhaps, that he had already given back far more than he had received. The wind had picked up again, slicing through alleyways and side streets with a sharpness that made people walk faster, heads down, hands buried in their coats. But Eli moved slowly through the Lower East Side, dragging a plastic bag with a pair of 2 large boots he'd salvaged from the donation bin behind the church on Delancey. They weren't warm, but they were better than the sneakers with holes he'd outgrown months ago. He didn't go back to the shelter that night. He had a spot, behind a mechanic's garage on Avenue C, half sheltered by a dumpster, where the ground stayed dry unless it rained. He laid down a flattened cardboard box, sat on it, and stared at the skyline peeking between buildings. Somewhere up there, beyond the reach of streetlights and steam vents, were the people who made decisions that shaped lives like his. But none of them had ever sat beside him on the sidewalk. Except one. Eli reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out the business card again. He hadn't told anyone he had it. He hadn't shown it to the volunteers, the case workers, the other kids at the shelter. It wasn't a magic ticket. He didn't even know if the number still worked. But it was a link, a thread, to someone who had seen him, really seen him, if only for a moment. He flipped the card over and stared at the back. It was blank, just clean white stock. But he remembered how Nathaniel's hands had trembled when he gave it to him. Not with fear, exactly, but with something that felt like surrender. Eli wasn't sure why he hadn't thrown the card away like the others. Over the years, people had handed him 100 cards, social workers, food programs, city outreach teams, but they always came with the same expressions, the same rehearsed sympathy. Nathaniel's face hadn't looked like theirs. It had looked cracked. He tucked the card away again and lay down, pulling his coat tighter over his shoulders. The boots made for an awkward pillow, but he was used to discomfort. As the city rumbled in the distance, he thought again about what Nathaniel had said, that people only talked to him when they wanted something. Maybe that's why Eli had stayed so long that day. Because he hadn't wanted anything at all. By morning, the garage lights flicked on, and Eli stirred. He wiped the condensation from his lashes, packed up his cardboard, and slipped through the alley toward the subway. He had no fare, but he knew the gaps in the fencing, the blind spots in the cameras. He moved like a shadow, careful not to attract attention. He rode the train uptown, past the usual volunteers, past the shelter check-ins, until he reached a neighborhood with cleaner streets and thicker scarves. Something about that day felt different. The wind carried purpose, not just cold. He stopped near a school on the east side. He couldn't explain why, he just liked watching the kids pour through the gates, their backpacks full, their shoes dry. It didn't make him bitter. It made him curious. He wondered if any of them would ever sit on a curb with no one to call. That afternoon, Eli returned to the public library near Bryant Park. He wasn't supposed to be inside for long, but the security guard on the main floor had stopped chasing him out months ago. He always kept to the same corner, third floor, far left, where the finance section bled into biographies. There, tucked between two metal shelves, Eli would sit cross-legged and read. He had taught himself basic math by reading old textbooks with missing pages. He didn't understand all the words, but he liked the ones that repeated: equity, growth, strategy. They sounded like magic spells. Like things people with control knew how to say. One book in particular caught his eye that day. It was thick, with a worn spine and a faded title, Building Empires from the Ground Up. He opened it and froze. There, on the inside flap, was a black and white photo of the author. Sharp suit. Serious expression. Nathaniel Ross. The same man who had cried into his hands just days before. Eli ran his fingers over the picture, trying to connect the two versions of the man. He looked younger in the photo. More certain. His eyes were cold, focused, like someone who had already decided what success should look like. Eli flipped through the pages. Chapter headings shouted things like, "Winning is the only option," and "Lead with relentless confidence." He frowned. These weren't the words of the man who had sat on the sidewalk with his tie loose and his voice cracking. This was a different creature entirely. Still, he read for hours. There was something addicting about the logic, the structure. He didn't understand all the case studies, but the rhythm of the language made sense. He copied terms into a notebook he had found in the trash behind a stationery store. Gross margin. Asset class. Exit strategy. By the time the sun began to fall, he had filled 3 pages. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about food. He was thinking about future. Later that night, back in his alley, Eli whispered into the dark, "I lost everything too. But I'm still here." He wasn't talking to anyone. Or maybe he was. Maybe he was talking to Nathaniel, to himself, to the skyline that never looked down. The following morning, something strange happened. He found a backpack on the edge of the alley. Inside, a new hoodie, a water bottle, 2 apples, and a copy of the New York Times. No note. No signature. But the page folded on top had an article circled in red ink: "Former tycoon Ross seeks redemption through nonprofit work." Eli stared at the photo beneath the headline. Nathaniel again. Older. Humbled. Still wearing that same tired suit. But this time, he was standing beside a group of volunteers loading supplies into a van. He didn't look defeated anymore. He looked like someone rebuilding something, not an empire, maybe, but something better. Eli held the backpack tightly. He didn't smile. Not exactly. But his breath left his chest a little softer. For the first time in a long time, the city didn't feel as big. And neither did he. The backpack stayed by Eli's side for the next 3 days. He didn't wear the new hoodie at first, too suspicious of its sudden appearance. It had no tags, no label. The apples were fresh, the water bottle unopened. The folded newspaper remained inside, unread beyond the circled article about Nathaniel. It felt too coincidental, too purposeful. Still, he didn't throw it away. Eli's instincts, honed by years of abandonment and shallow promises, kept him cautious. But the city had a strange way of threading fates together, and despite his suspicion, something kept pointing him back to that one moment: the sandwich, the card, the words exchanged with a man who, by every definition Eli knew, should never have sat on that sidewalk. On the morning of the fourth day, he returned to the library. It had become more than a shelter, it was a classroom. With each visit, he learned a little more, not just from the books but from watching how people moved, how they whispered answers to each other during tutoring sessions, how they looked up words in dictionaries or checked facts on computers. Eli was invisible among them, but his notebook filled quickly. This time, however, he didn't reach the third floor. Near the entrance, just past the metal detector, a woman stood with a clipboard and a man beside her in a dark overcoat. Both were scanning the room. Not searching in panic, but observing. As if they were waiting. Eli instinctively turned back toward the doors. But the woman saw him. Eli Thompson? He froze. No one said his full name out loud unless it was at a shelter intake or a hospital. No one ever said it like they had been looking for him specifically. "I'm Anna," the woman said gently. She was in her 30s, dressed plainly, a warmth in her voice that didn't feel rehearsed. "This is Marcus. We work with an organization called New Ground." Eli didn't answer. "We're not the government," she added quickly. "And we're not police. We're part of a non-profit. One that's, well, it's hard to explain here. Do you have a few minutes?" Eli narrowed his eyes. "Did someone send you?" Anna smiled, a little surprised. "In a way, yes." Marcus stepped forward and handed Eli a sealed envelope. It was thick, with his name typed neatly across the front. He didn't open it right away. He looked up at them, unsure if this was a trick or just another dead end. But Anna's eyes didn't look away. They waited, patient. Eli stepped to the side, near a pillar, and slowly opened the flap. Inside was a folded letter, printed on clean white paper. The header read, "Ross Initiative for Renewal." And under it, in smaller text, a line jumped off the page. "To the boy who gave me more than a sandwich." Eli read every word. The letter was written by Nathaniel. It spoke of that morning on the sidewalk, of how that one moment had started something inside him that he didn't understand at first. It spoke of loss, and guilt, and the slow, painful process of facing everything he had run from. But more than anything, it spoke of responsibility. Nathaniel had launched a non-profit, quietly, without press conferences or grand speeches. It was focused on rebuilding small businesses ruined by corporate collapse, but also on creating community programs for youth like Eli, those who had been pushed aside, passed through the system, forgotten. The letter ended with a sentence that Eli read twice. "If you are reading this, then I kept my word. I don't know if you believe in promises. But I meant mine." He lowered the paper. His chest felt strange. Not heavy exactly, just full in a way that was unfamiliar. Anna stepped closer. "There's a space for you, if you want it. A transitional school partnered with our program. It's small. Private. You wouldn't have to stay at the shelter anymore. There's housing included. Tutors. Food. A counselor. No press, no stories. Just a fresh place to stand." Eli didn't speak for several seconds. "Why me?" "You started something," Marcus said. And he remembered. Eli stared at the letter. "He really sent this?" Anna nodded. "He's been trying to find you for weeks. Traced the card. Asked every contact he had. Even had someone watching the libraries." That explained the backpack. Eli looked down at his torn sneakers, then at the clean lettering of his name printed so precisely on the envelope. He remembered what Nathaniel looked like in the article, loading boxes into vans, eyes tired but alert. That wasn't a man trying to erase a past. That was someone building something new. He folded the letter slowly and slipped it back inside the envelope. "Where's the school?" he asked. Anna gave him a small smile. "Brooklyn. Just across the bridge. You'll have your own space. There's a boy your age who's into math too. You might like him." Eli gave a small nod. He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no. 3 hours later, He was sitting in the back of a van heading toward Brooklyn. The city rushed past the windows, gray and unforgiving, but somehow different. The building they arrived at wasn't grand, no marble steps or giant banners, but it had life. Laughter spilled from a second-floor window. Music pulsed faintly from a room in the back. And on the wall near the entrance, painted in modest lettering, was a phrase. Hope doesn't knock. Sometimes it waits to be seen. Inside, the director of the youth program greeted him with a handshake. Her name was Miss Lorraine, and she didn't ask him to talk. She just handed him a key. Room 5. Second floor. No roommates unless you want one. Eli stood in the hallway for a few moments, unsure. The building smelled like old wood and fresh bread. Someone was cooking downstairs. When he reached the room, he opened the door slowly. A twin bed. A desk. A window with a view of the street. A new pair of shoes on the floor. And taped to the wall above the bed, a single printed photo. It was blurry, taken from a distance. But it showed him, Eli, kneeling on a sidewalk beside a man in a gray suit. No one else in the frame was looking at them. But in that frozen second, they were looking only at each other. Eli stared at it for a long time. He didn't cry. But he did sit down on the edge of the bed and whisper to no one, maybe promises are real. Sometimes. The first month in Brooklyn passed slowly but steadily. Eli kept mostly to himself. The other kids at the transitional school were polite but cautious, each carrying their own silent histories. The building had a rhythm to it, mornings filled with quiet structure, afternoons with group workshops, and evenings with shared meals prepared by rotating volunteers. Eli's room became a small sanctuary. The bed, though firm, was clean. The desk was his, untouched by others. He spent hours there with his notebook, copying words from business articles Miss Lorraine brought him. Terms he couldn't yet understand filled the pages: equity dilution, compound interest, asset reallocation. He didn't know what he would do with them yet. But the shapes of the words felt like tools, future weapons against a life that had once felt too large to fight. Each day, a little more of the outside world found its way in. A man named Glenn came in twice a week to teach financial literacy through card games and trading simulations. Another volunteer named Rosa introduced them to coding using second-hand laptops. But it wasn't until the visit from the program's founder that everything shifted again. It was a Thursday afternoon when Miss Lorraine entered the common room during study hour and made a quiet announcement. "We have a guest visiting today. I'd like you all to stay respectful. He's the reason we're able to do what we do here." Eli was in the corner, scribbling in his notebook. He froze mid-word. Through the doorway stepped Nathaniel Ross. His appearance had changed. The suit was still there, but simpler, no tie, no flash. He had let some gray grow into his beard, and the deep tiredness in his eyes had given way to something steadier, more focused. He moved with less urgency than the man Eli remembered. Slower, but not weaker. Eli looked down, unsure of what to do. He had imagined this moment, but never planned for it. Nathaniel greeted each student personally, shaking hands, asking names, complimenting sketches, science projects, coding screens. Then he turned toward the corner where Eli sat, still seated, the notebook open before him. Their eyes met. It was quiet. No one else seemed to notice the shift, but to Eli, the moment felt stretched, like the space between them had become a tunnel leading back to that sidewalk in Manhattan. Nathaniel approached and lowered himself into the chair across from Eli. "I was hoping you'd come," he said. Eli didn't reply immediately. He tapped his pen once, then set it down. "You sent the backpack." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "I figured you'd know." There was a beat of silence between them. Not awkward. Just heavy. "I thought you disappeared," Eli said. "I did," Nathaniel replied. "For a while. I needed to lose everything before I could figure out what mattered." Eli studied him. "You look different." "I feel different." Eli glanced down at his notebook. Nathaniel followed his gaze and saw the pages, dense with notes and questions written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. "You've been studying," he said. "I want to learn how things work," Eli answered. "How people build stuff. How they lose it. And how they get it back." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "That's a better education than I ever got." "I'm not trying to be like you," Eli added. Nathaniel smiled. "Good. You should be better." Another pause. Then Nathaniel leaned back slightly, letting his hand rest on the edge of the table. "This place," he said, glancing around the room, "was built with help from people I once let down. Investors, old clients, people who believed in me even after everything fell apart. They helped fund this, not for me, but because they believed the world could still be repaired." "Why me?" Eli asked. "Why did you look for me?" Nathaniel took a breath. "Because you stopped. Because you didn't want anything. And because you reminded me that value isn't in what you have, but in what you're willing to give, even when you have nothing." Eli shifted in his seat. "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know," Nathaniel said. "And that's why it mattered." For a moment, they simply sat together. The noise of the other students continued around them, muffled laughter, pages turning, chairs scraping, but the connection between them held steady, quiet. Nathaniel reached into his coat and pulled out a slim black folder. He slid it across the table to Eli. Inside were papers, a scholarship application already filled with Eli's name and information. Along with it, a recommendation letter on the nonprofit's letterhead, signed by Nathaniel himself. "There's a summer program at the Stern School of Business," he said. "Just 6 weeks. Classes, guest speakers, group projects. It's for kids your age who show promise. You've already been nominated. If you accept, you'll be sponsored by the foundation." Eli stared at the papers. "Is this because you feel guilty?" Nathaniel shook his head. "This is because you're the reason I got back up." Eli didn't speak for a long time. His fingers brushed the edge of the folder. "I don't know if I'll fit in." "You don't have to," Nathaniel said. "Just walk in. That's enough." Eli slowly closed the folder. He didn't commit. But the fact that he didn't push it away was already something. Nathaniel stood. "You don't owe me anything, Eli. But if you ever want to build something, I'll be here to help you do it right." Eli met his eyes one more time. "Are you happy now?" The question was not childish. It was surgical. Nathaniel answered honestly. "I'm not finished yet. But I'm better." With that, he offered a hand. Eli stood, hesitated, then shook it. It wasn't the handshake of a millionaire and a beggar. It was something far more equal. When Nathaniel left, Miss Lorraine approached and sat where he had been. "You okay?" she asked. Eli nodded. "I think so." "You don't have to decide anything tonight," she said, motioning to the folder. "But I think he's right about one thing." Eli looked at her. "You're not like him," she said. "You're stronger." That night, Eli placed the folder on his desk, next to his notebook. He didn't open it again. But he sat at the window for a long time, watching the streetlights flicker to life. The city still roared outside. But it no longer felt like it would swallow him. In the weeks that followed Nathaniel's visit, life settled into a quieter rhythm for Eli, but the air around him had changed. There was a subtle pull, a constant hum in the background, like something just beneath the surface of the ordinary had begun to shift. The folder from the Stern summer program remained on his desk, unopened since that day, though he touched it often, moving it to make space, placing books beneath it, wiping the desk clean around it. As if some part of him was afraid that opening it would make the choice real. At night, when the building quieted and the street sounds became distant echoes, Eli wrote. He had started keeping pages hidden behind a loose floorboard under his bed, not schoolwork, not the financial notes that filled his other notebooks, but something else. Letters. The first one had begun as a scrap of thought on a torn envelope. Then another. Then full pages. Always addressed to the same person. Nathaniel. He never sent them. He wasn't sure he ever would. But the act of writing, of trying to put words to things he didn't say aloud, was like breathing in a room that had always been locked. In one letter, he described the first time he realized he wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. In another, he described a dream where he was sitting at a long table, giving orders in a meeting room with glass walls, like the ones he had seen in the finance books. Except in the dream, no one at the table wore suits. They were kids. All kids. In yet another letter, he wrote about a memory he couldn't forget, the sound of the sirens the night his parents died, how the world had turned red and white and loud, and how it had never fully gone quiet since. He kept these letters carefully folded, stacked and tied with a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt. Not because he planned to send them, but because they reminded him that his story was still unfolding, not sealed in trauma, not defined solely by survival. One rainy afternoon, Miss Lorraine found him in the library room, alone, staring at the window. "You're missing class," she said gently. "It's review day. I already know the material." She didn't argue. "Still, you should be there. Not for the lesson. For the others. I'm not like them. They don't need you to be like them. Just with them." Eli looked at her. "Do you think people ever really change? Or do they just start acting differently?" She considered that. Maybe both. Sometimes people change because they want to. Sometimes because they have to. And sometimes, they meet someone who makes them think they should. That night, Eli returned to his letters. But instead of writing a new one, he began rewriting one of the older ones. He didn't know why, only that the words didn't feel finished. This time, he included a line he hadn't dared to write before. "I don't know if I want to be like you. But I want to understand how you became you." The words stayed with him the next morning, even as he walked through Brooklyn with the other students for their weekly visit to the Foundation's downtown annex, a building that served as the heart of Nathaniel's new nonprofit work. Eli had never gone inside. He had always chosen to stay behind with Lorraine or skip the visit altogether, offering excuses about being tired or needing to study. But this time, something pulled him forward. The annex wasn't sleek or polished like Eli imagined. It was modest, with brick walls and wide windows, filled with real people, volunteers, local business owners, teenagers in community programs. The energy inside was different from any place he had known. No one looked down at anyone else. Everyone looked busy, with purpose. He drifted toward the back of the building, where glass walls separated a conference room from the rest of the space. Inside, Nathaniel stood at a whiteboard, sleeves rolled up, leading a workshop with a group of adults, business owners, judging by the look of them. They weren't the rich types from his old world. These were grocers, barbers, mechanics. One woman still had her apron on. They were all watching him closely. Eli stood at the edge of the glass, unnoticed, and watched. Nathaniel spoke with conviction but without the arrogance that had once clung to him in the old photos. He asked more questions than he gave answers. He listened. He gestured toward graphs but always returned to the people in the room. When the meeting ended, and the group began to disperse, Nathaniel caught a glimpse of the boy standing silently just beyond the door. He stepped out into the hallway. "You found the annex." "I wasn't planning to come in," Eli admitted. "I just kept walking." Nathaniel nodded. "That happens here. Things start without plans." They walked together down the hallway in silence for a while. The building smelled like fresh coffee and pencil shavings. Eli could hear someone typing quickly in a back office. "I've been writing letters," he said suddenly. Nathaniel looked over. "To who?" "To you." Nathaniel didn't respond right away. Then he said, "Will I get to read them someday?" Eli shook his head. "They're not ready. Maybe they're not meant to be read." "Then why write them?" "To make things make sense." They stopped near the back stairwell. A window overlooked the alley behind the building, where a mural covered one wall, a pair of open hands releasing a flock of birds into a stormy sky. "I haven't decided about the program yet," Eli said. "You don't have to," Nathaniel replied. "You're already doing the work." "But it feels like I'm waiting for something." Nathaniel leaned against the wall. "Sometimes we wait because we're afraid the next step will change us. Is that what happened to you?" "I didn't wait," Nathaniel said. "I ran straight into the storm. Lost almost everything. And for a long time, I thought that was the end." Eli looked up at him. "And now?" Nathaniel looked out the window. "Now I think it was the beginning." Eli didn't answer. But when they walked back into the building, side by side, he didn't slow his pace to let the man go ahead. That evening, in his room, Eli untied the cloth from the letters and removed one, just one. He didn't reread it. He placed it into a new envelope, sealed it, and wrote a name on the front. No return address. No explanation. Just one name, Nathaniel. The next day, he left it on Lorraine's desk and said nothing. And in that small, silent act, Eli took another step forward, not toward who Nathaniel was, or who anyone expected him to be, but toward who he was becoming. Someone who wrote his own story. Even when no one else read it. By the time spring reached Brooklyn, the trees outside the school turned a soft, trembling green, and the streets filled again with sound, the kind that didn't come from sirens or engines, but from laughter, movement, life. Eli walked the same streets now with a different posture. He no longer kept his head down. He no longer scanned for escape routes. He noticed things. Noticed faces, colors, voices. And more importantly, people noticed him. He had made his decision. The folder that had once sat untouched on his desk now lived in a slim canvas bag he carried with him daily. He'd submitted the application to the Stern summer program quietly, without ceremony. Miss Lorraine had smiled when he handed it to her, but said nothing, as if she understood that some victories needed to be honored in silence. It was the first decision Eli made entirely for himself. The response came 2 weeks later, tucked in a plain envelope that Lorraine placed on his desk before breakfast. The letter was short, formal, typed on stern letterhead. But the only sentence Eli read more than once was the one at the center of the page: "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted." He didn't shout. He didn't tell the other kids. But that night, when the building fell quiet and the city lights pushed shadows against his window, Eli opened a new notebook, one not filled with survival tactics or business terms, and wrote, with slow precision, "This is where it begins." The program started in early June. Stern's campus was like another world. Towering buildings with glass fronts reflected the sky, and the students who moved between them seemed certain of who they were. Eli arrived early on the first day, dressed in a plain button-up shirt, the new pair of shoes he had received in the Brooklyn school, and his old canvas bag slung across his shoulder. Inside, the halls buzzed with energy. Orientation day was loud, structured, and full of forced interactions. Eli kept to the edge, watching as others formed quick bonds over shared schools, hobbies, or connections. When the group split into learning clusters, he was placed in a small team of 5. One boy, Isaiah, greeted him immediately with a quick nod and a grin. "You know anything about stocks?" "Some," Eli replied. "Cool. I know nothing. Guess you're in charge." That small exchange became a door. In the days that followed, Isaiah pulled Eli into study sessions, cafeteria conversations, walks around the campus. The others followed. Before long, Eli was speaking more than he had in months, about compound growth, about ethics in business, even about his ideas for nonprofit investing models that could teach financial literacy to kids in shelters. The group listened. They asked questions. They respected his answers. For the first time, Eli wasn't the quiet boy in the corner. He was the one others turned to. One afternoon, after a guest speaker's lecture on rebuilding public trust in failed companies, the floor opened for questions. Dozens of hands shot up. Eli's stayed down, until the moderator pointed at him directly. "You, in the second row." Eli stood, slowly. His voice, when it came, was steady. What matters more to a company's future, its brand or its integrity? A hush passed through the room. The speaker, a former executive who had once faced a major corruption scandal, paused before answering. "I used to think they were the same," the man said. "But brand is how the world sees you. Integrity is who you are when the world stops watching. One can be rebuilt with money. The other must be rebuilt with truth." Eli nodded and sat back down. Later that day, the speaker sought him out in the lobby. "You've seen failure, haven't you?" he asked. "Yes," Eli answered. "Up close." The man offered him a business card. "If you ever want an internship, look me up." Eli took it but didn't promise anything. He had learned by now that not every offer needed to be taken. Some were worth holding on to. Some were just reminders that people were watching, and that he had become someone worth watching. Halfway through the program, the students were asked to design a mock project, a startup, a nonprofit, a hybrid. Eli's team looked at him immediately. "You've got that notebook," Isaiah said. "The one with all the wild ideas." "They're not all good ideas," Eli warned. "Doesn't matter. You're the one who thinks like this." So Eli led. Not by pushing, not by dominating, but by listening first. Their project was a platform that used community businesses to teach basic financial skills through small apprenticeships. One student would work one-on-one with a local vendor, bakers, barbers, mechanics, and learn both trade and budgeting. The model was simple but human, rooted in real experiences. When presentation day arrived, Eli stood before the panel, wearing the same plain shirt, his shoes polished, his words clear. "This idea was born from watching people lose everything," he said. "And from learning how the smallest moments of dignity can shape someone's entire direction. Not everyone needs a handout. Some just need a way in." There was silence at the end. Then applause. From judges. From students. Even from the staff. The project earned top marks. That night, as students celebrated in the campus courtyard, Eli walked alone for a while, then made his way to a bench near the administrative building. He sat there, letting the noise fade behind him, and pulled out his notebook. He didn't write anything. He just sat with it open, letting the pages breathe. Then he heard a familiar voice. "Thought I might find you here." Eli looked up. Nathaniel stood a few feet away, his hands in his coat pockets, his face relaxed. "I heard about your presentation," he said. "Isaiah's mom works in the same building as one of our board members. She couldn't stop talking about your project." Eli offered a half smile. "It was just an idea." "No. It was a blueprint." Nathaniel sat beside him. "Do you know what I've been thinking about?" he asked. Eli didn't answer. "The day we met," Nathaniel continued. "That sidewalk. That sandwich. I keep wondering if I would have stood up at all that day, if you hadn't stopped." Eli kept his eyes on the notebook. "I still have the wax paper," Nathaniel said quietly. "From the sandwich. It's stupid, I know. But I kept it. Because I needed to remember that the smallest gifts sometimes carry the biggest weight." They sat in silence again. Then Eli turned to him. "I want to help run something." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Run what?" "Not just programs. Something that lasts. Something that turns ideas into jobs, and jobs into futures." Nathaniel smiled. "Then you're ready." "For what?" "For the next chapter." Eli nodded. And somewhere deep inside, for the first time in his life, he felt the truth of it. He was. The auditorium was larger than Eli had expected. It wasn't the sheer size of the room that made his chest tighten, it was the people. Rows upon rows of professionals, students, educators, investors, and reporters filled the space with a low hum of conversations, programs rustling, and cameras clicking. The annual summit of the Ross Initiative had grown quickly since its inception, and this year's lineup featured founders, city officials, and non-profit leaders. But the name listed at the bottom of the final program page was the one that drew the most attention: Eli Thompson, youth advisor and scholar, Ross Initiative for Renewal. He sat backstage, watching through a narrow slit in the curtain. The host had just finished introducing the speaker before him, a prominent tech philanthropist who was now answering questions about scalable mentorship systems. Eli wasn't listening. His hands were resting in his lap, fingers curled slightly, the notebook he had brought unopened beside him. He had been asked to speak weeks earlier. At first, he had declined. The thought of standing in front of hundreds, maybe thousands, and sharing his story felt like exposing a wound. But Nathaniel hadn't pushed. He'd simply said, "If you don't speak, someone else will. And they might not get it right." That had stayed with him. So, reluctantly, Eli had said yes. Still, in the hours before the event, doubt had crept in. He wasn't polished like the other speakers. He didn't have an MBA, or a title that came with a corner office. He didn't know the rules of speechwriting or how to charm a crowd. All he had was what he had lived. What he had chosen to remember. And what he had chosen not to forget. A voice backstage called his name. It was time. Eli stood, adjusted his shirt collar, and walked toward the podium. The stage lights were warm and blinding, casting the faces of the audience into a sea of shadows. He could see no one clearly. But he knew Nathaniel was there, sitting in the front row, just as he had promised. The applause was polite, curious. Eli took a breath, gripped the sides of the lectern, and leaned forward slightly. Then, he began. "I was 10 years old when I gave a sandwich to a man crying on the sidewalk." The room fell silent. I didn't know his name. I didn't know what he had lost. I just knew what it felt like to be invisible. And that morning, he looked like I used to feel, like someone the world had walked past one too many times. He paused, letting the silence hold. I had one sandwich. It wasn't special. It was the kind you get from a volunteer in a subway tunnel. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing I owned. And I gave it away because I thought he needed it more than I did. Eli's voice didn't shake. It didn't rise in dramatic swells. But it carried. That man turned out to be Nathaniel Ross. At the time, I didn't know he was famous, or powerful, or that his company had collapsed. I didn't care. I just saw someone who had forgotten how to stand up. A murmur moved through the audience, recognition, surprise, discomfort. I grew up in shelters. I've eaten out of trash bins. I've watched people make promises they didn't keep. So when he handed me a business card and said, "Come find me when you're ready," I didn't believe him. Why would I? Adults don't usually come back. He looked out toward the crowd, knowing now that many of them were reading his name on the program and finally connecting the dots. But he did. He came back. And when he did, he didn't just offer me help. He offered me a chance to see myself as more than just a survivor. Eli reached into his coat and pulled out the card. The same one, now faded and soft at the edges. "I kept this," he said. "Not because it meant everything would change. But because it reminded me that someone had seen me." He placed it on the podium. Since then, I've worked with this foundation, studied finance, built a youth-centered model for mentorship, and stood in rooms like this one. But none of that matters if I forget where it started. On a sidewalk. In the cold. Between two people who had nothing left to lose. A stillness filled the room. You might be thinking this is a redemption story. That it's about how a rich man fell and a poor kid rose. But it's not. Eli's eyes swept the darkness beyond the lights. It's about how help doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from the sidewalk up. And sometimes, the people who have the least to give are the ones who understand giving the most. The audience didn't stir. No rustling, no coughing, no fidgeting. Just silence. Eli closed his notebook, even though he hadn't read from it once. "I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to remind you that wealth isn't always about money. And hunger isn't always about food. He stepped back from the podium. For a second, nothing happened. Then the first wave of applause broke from the center of the room, followed by a rising swell from the wings, then the back, and then all around. It wasn't loud at first, it was reverent. People stood slowly, some with heads bowed, others clapping hard, some wiping at their faces. The cameras snapped, but they felt distant, almost irrelevant. Nathaniel stood in the front row, hands in his pockets, looking up at Eli with no trace of performance, just pride. Quiet, deep, earned. After the event, people tried to approach Eli, journalists, foundation heads, CEOs, but he politely nodded and slipped away backstage, taking the side door into the cool air outside. The street was quieter now, and the sky above the city had turned a rich, burnt orange. Eli stood on the curb, the same way he once had years ago, holding a paper cup and waiting for someone to see him. But now, he was the one people waited to see. Isaiah caught up to him minutes later, still breathless. That was. I mean, you leveled the whole room. Eli offered a tired grin. I said what I needed to say. That last line? About hunger? That's going viral by tomorrow. Eli didn't answer. He wasn't thinking about virality. He was thinking about something else. About a boy who once said, "You look hungrier than me." And how that moment had grown into a lifetime's worth of meaning. The weeks after Eli's speech passed in a blur of new attention. The clip from the summit, trimmed to 2 minutes and 31 seconds, was shared by major media outlets and reposted thousands of times across platforms. Eli's quiet tone, his clarity, his final lines, help doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from the sidewalk up, had become a rallying cry across social programs and educational spaces. But while the world moved around him, Eli didn't shift. He kept his routines the same. He still woke early. Still wrote in his notebook every night. Still returned to the Brooklyn campus twice a week to meet with students coming into the same transition program he had once been part of. He didn't carry himself like someone who had gone viral. He carried himself like someone who remembered exactly where he came from. One afternoon in late summer, Miss Lorraine called him into her office. The room was small, with stacks of binders crowding the window ledge and an old photo of her first graduating class on the back wall. She didn't stand when he walked in, just pointed to the chair across from her and gestured for him to sit. "There's something I want to ask you," she said, opening a drawer. She pulled out a sealed envelope and slid it across the desk. "What is it?" Eli asked. She folded her hands. "An offer. From Nathaniel." Eli tilted his head. "I thought he was stepping back from operations." "He is," she said. "But he's not stepping away from the mission." Eli opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single-page letter, printed on Ross Initiative letterhead. The message was direct. "Eli, we've grown beyond what I can lead alone. We're launching a new division for youth development across 3 cities, Brooklyn, Chicago, and Detroit. I want you to lead it. Not as a figurehead. As a director. You've already done the work. This would make it official. If you're ready, the position is yours. N." Eli set the paper down carefully. He didn't speak for a full minute. Miss Lorraine broke the silence. "It's not a symbolic gesture. The role would come with real authority. Budget oversight. Hiring. Curriculum shaping. Strategic planning." Eli kept his eyes on the page. "That's a lot. You've handled more than most people twice your age," she said. "And you've never once asked for the credit." Eli exhaled slowly. "Does he really think I can do this?" "He doesn't just think," Lorraine said. "He knows. And more importantly, you know." Eli didn't give an answer that day. He took the letter with him, folded it neatly, and walked through the neighborhood for over an hour. The streets he knew well felt different now, full of invisible lines that led somewhere else. He passed the old donation center where he'd once picked out his winter coat. He passed the alley where he'd once slept behind the mechanic's shop. He passed the church steps where, during a snowstorm, a stranger had handed him a hot drink without saying a word. Everything felt like a map he hadn't realized he was drawing. That night, Eli returned to the place where it had all started. He took the train into Manhattan, walked east toward Park Avenue, and stopped at the exact spot where he had first seen Nathaniel crying on the sidewalk. It had changed. The bank building was now a sleek co-working space with green window decals. A cafe had opened on the corner. The sidewalk was cleaner. But Eli knew the spot. It was just in front of a vent, where the heat from the building made the air slightly warmer on winter mornings. He stood there for several minutes, unnoticed by the people rushing past, just as he had once gone unnoticed. Then he pulled out his phone, not to take a picture, but to check the time. 7 o'clock. He looked up at the sky, let the breeze settle around him, and then turned back toward the subway. He made his decision on the train ride home. 2 days later, Eli walked into the foundation's main office and sat across from Nathaniel in the conference room where they had once talked quietly over coffee. This time, the room had been prepared for something formal, papers spread out across the table, folders organized, the foundation's legal counsel present at the corner of the room. But Eli spoke before anyone else could begin. "I accept the role," he said. "But I want 3 conditions." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, smiling with interest. "Go on." "1," Eli said. "No media rollout. I don't want to be a story. I want to do the work." "Agreed." 2. I choose my own team. No board-approved placements. If this is youth development, then it starts with people who understand where we came from." "Fair." 3, Eli said, placing a sheet of paper in front of Nathaniel. "We launch a mentorship program for kids currently in shelters. One-on-one guidance. Real conversations. No brochures, no generic visits. Ongoing. Measured." Nathaniel picked up the page. His smile faded, but only because of the weight of the words. Then he nodded once. "Done." The agreement was signed that afternoon. By the end of the month, Eli had an office, small, window-facing, cluttered with plans. On the wall, he hung the now famous photo of him and Nathaniel from years ago, taken on the sidewalk, both figures bent forward, neither knowing yet what would come of that moment. But beside it, he placed something else, a corkboard, already filling with notes, goals, and names, students from Brooklyn, from Chicago, from shelters where the pain was still raw, still present, still undignified. Eli didn't call himself a leader. He didn't need to. He showed up every day, first to arrive, last to leave. He listened more than he spoke. He trained the staff to do the same. He built systems not around charity, but around trust. Around sustainability. Around rebuilding not just the future, but the present. And at the foundation's end-of-year gathering, Nathaniel stood before the staff and donors and made a simple announcement. "We've grown," he said. "And the person leading that growth isn't me anymore. It's the boy who reminded me how to begin again." He gestured toward Eli, who was sitting at the edge of the stage, clipboard in hand. "Today," Nathaniel said, "we name Eli Thompson as Director of Youth Advancement Programs." The room erupted in applause, but Eli didn't stand right away. He closed his folder first, stepped forward, and then, quietly, calmly, shook Nathaniel's hand. There were no speeches. No grand moment. Just a look between two people who had changed each other's lives. And a room that knew, without needing to be told, that a full circle had been completed. The television studio was bright and cold, the kind of place where smiles stretched too wide and everything moved according to a carefully timed schedule. Eli stood just beyond the frame, waiting for his cue, a production assistant counting down from 5 with silent hand gestures. He was dressed plainly, as he always was, clean shirt, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, notebook tucked into his side. The invitation had come from one of the nation's leading primetime news shows. They were running a series called Voices That Changed Us, and someone on the production team had seen the video of Eli's summit speech. The idea was simple: one live interview, 7 minutes of airtime, no scripted questions. Eli had initially declined, but after a long conversation with Miss Lorraine, he'd agreed on one condition: he could speak only if the segment included a real discussion about youth homelessness and the systems failing them. Now, the moment had come. The host smiled at him from the desk as the cameras rolled. "We're back, and with us tonight is Eli Thompson, the young director of youth programs at the Ross Initiative, whose speech last month continues to resonate across the country. Eli, thank you for joining us." Eli leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "Thanks for having me. You've become something of a symbol," the host began. "From the streets of New York to the head of one of the fastest-growing youth initiatives in the country. But let's go back. Who were you before all this started?" Eli took a breath. "A kid who didn't have a place to stay. Who thought being ignored was normal. Who thought hunger was just part of life." The host nodded, visibly moved. "You've said before that one of the defining moments in your life was the day you gave your only sandwich to a man on the street. What made you do that?" There was a pause. Eli didn't rush. "He looked like I felt," he said. "Not hungry for food, hungry for something else. Connection. Dignity. Maybe just proof that someone saw him." "You didn't know who he was at the time?" "No. Not until later. He could have been anyone. That's what matters." The host leaned in. "And yet, that act changed both of your lives." Eli looked down for a second, then met her gaze again. "We talk a lot about giving, who has more, who has less. But we don't talk enough about the kind of giving that costs something. I had one meal. One. And I gave it away. Not because I was brave. Not because I thought I'd get anything in return. But because I couldn't not do it." The host was silent for a moment. Then she said, "There's a quote of yours that's gone viral. It's been printed on posters, shared online, even mentioned by several public figures. You said, 'He had money, but no one.' I knew how that felt." "What did you mean by that?" Eli didn't blink. "Loneliness doesn't care how rich you are. You can have 100 suits, a penthouse, a bank account full of zeros, and still be starving inside." That day, Nathaniel had everything except someone to sit beside him. "So I did." A beat passed in the studio. The host cleared her throat. "Some people say you're unusually mature. That you carry yourself like someone twice your age." "I've lived twice my age," Eli replied. "Do you feel proud of how far you've come?" He considered the question carefully. "Pride isn't the goal," he said. "Stability is. Building something that lasts. Making sure the next kid like me doesn't have to give away their only sandwich to be noticed." The host smiled again, softer now. "One last question. What would you say to that version of yourself, the boy on the sidewalk, if you could talk to him now?" Eli looked directly into the camera. The lights reflected in his eyes, but his expression remained calm. "I'd say, you were never broken. Just waiting for the world to stop walking past you." The segment ended there. The crew clapped lightly, and the host thanked him off-air. But Eli didn't linger. He exited the studio alone, slipping into the back seat of the Foundation's car that had brought him. On the ride back, he didn't look at his phone, though he could hear it buzzing with new messages. Later that night, he sat in his office, the city lights glowing through the windows behind him. On his desk, a small stack of letters had been placed, handwritten notes sent by youth from across the country. One, from a girl in Missouri, simply read, "I didn't think people like us could ever be seen. Now I think maybe we can." Eli tucked the letter into his drawer and leaned back in his chair. Moments later, Nathaniel knocked gently at the door. "Mind if I come in?" "Sure," Eli said, motioning to the chair across from him. Nathaniel sat, taking in the room, the clean whiteboards filled with plans, the growing bulletin board of student names, and the photo still framed on the wall. He smiled. "I saw the interview," he said. Eli gave a small nod. "You said something that stuck with me," Nathaniel continued. "Giving that costs something. I've been thinking about that all day." "It's the only kind of giving that changes things," Eli replied. Nathaniel sat back, thoughtful. "You know, people keep saying you changed my life. And that's true. But what I've never said out loud is that I didn't think I deserved to be helped." Eli met his eyes. "No one has to earn being seen." They were quiet for a long time. Then Nathaniel reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, wrapped in clear plastic. "I brought you something," he said, setting it on the desk. It was a sandwich. Ham and mustard. Wrapped in wax paper. Eli stared at it, then picked it up carefully. "It's not symbolic," Nathaniel said. "It's just lunch. But I thought, maybe it was time I brought one to you." Eli didn't laugh. He didn't need to. The quiet between them was enough. Later, as they sat eating together in the office, sharing a simple meal like they had never had the chance to before, Eli thought about how far they had come, not just in miles, but in meaning. Two people, once strangers. Both brought to their knees by the world. Now, side by side. Giving. Not because they had much. But because they had everything that mattered. The morning air on Park Avenue was crisp and quiet, the kind of late autumn day that seemed suspended between seasons. The sun had not yet fully climbed, but its first light spilled across the polished windows of the high-rises, casting golden reflections on the sidewalk below. The streets were not yet crowded. Delivery trucks hummed down side lanes. A woman jogged past, her breath visible. Somewhere in the distance, a construction crew shouted instructions over metal clangs. And standing alone at the edge of the street, near a grate that let off a soft current of warm air, was Eli Thompson. He had returned to the exact spot where it all began, not out of nostalgia, and not to be seen. There was no camera crew. No staged event. No one to impress. Just a man now in his early 20s, dressed in a simple wool coat, holding a single white rose. He looked down at the sidewalk. It hadn't changed much. A new cafe occupied the corner, and the glass facade of the bank had been replaced by a co-working brand. But the sidewalk remained, its cracks the same, its imperfections undisturbed. Eli crouched gently, set the rose down just beside the grate, and stood again. He stayed still for a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the steam rising faintly from the metal vents. A few people glanced at him as they passed, some slowing slightly, as if unsure whether they recognized him from somewhere, a headline, a speech, a shared video. But none interrupted. There was something in his posture that demanded reverence, even in silence. When he finally turned to leave, he walked without urgency. The city no longer loomed above him. It moved around him. At every corner, someone nodded in recognition. A doorman called his name and gave a thumbs up. A man with a camera from a local paper asked if he could get a quote for an upcoming feature on youth-led nonprofits. A child ran up beside him and said, "My mom showed me your video at dinner. You're the reason she started volunteering again." Eli responded with a quiet, "Thank you," then kept walking. By midday, he had made his way to the East Side building that now housed the headquarters of the youth division he led. The place buzzed with energy, young leaders in training, coordinators moving between conference calls and tutoring schedules, murals painted by the kids on every hallway wall. A new program had just launched, a 3-month entrepreneurship incubator for teens aging out of the foster system. Eli had fought for it personally, refusing to let it get buried under budget meetings or branding concerns. When he stepped into the main floor, a group of students applauded, not in a forced, ceremonial way, but in greeting. One of them held up a mock newspaper they'd made for a class assignment. On the front was a hand-drawn picture of Eli shaking hands with a teen in a graduation cap. Above it, in block letters, "The kid who taught the city to listen." He took the paper with a grin. "This is going on my wall." Later that afternoon, in a small private ceremony upstairs, Eli met with a group of foundation donors and board members. Nathaniel stood quietly off to the side, no longer in charge of operations but still a guiding voice behind the scenes. The room was modest, filled with people who knew when not to speak and when to simply observe. Eli stepped forward after the director introduced him. "I won't take long," he said. "I've said what I needed to say over the years. But today, I just want to acknowledge something that often gets lost in stories like mine." He paused. "I was never rescued. I wasn't saved. I was seen." He let the sentence sit. "That's all it took. One person who didn't step over me. Who didn't make assumptions. Who didn't wait for someone else to act." He turned slightly toward Nathaniel, not by name, but in gesture. "And when you've been seen like that, you learn how to see others. You learn how to lead not from above, but from beside." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small item. The old business card. It was nearly colorless now, the print faded to a dull outline, the corners curled. "I carry this not because I needed a name," Eli said, "but because it reminded me that I had one." Then he returned it to his coat and stepped back. There was no applause. Just a solemn kind of quiet, the kind that follows truth. After the event, Nathaniel approached him privately on the rooftop terrace, where the city stretched out in all directions. The wind had picked up, tugging gently at the edges of their coats. "You've built something I never could," Nathaniel said. "No," Eli replied. "You just built something first. And then gave me the space to do it my way." They stood side by side, looking out across the skyline. "You ever miss who you were?" Nathaniel asked. Eli thought for a moment. "No. I honor him. But I don't miss him." He didn't need to explain who him was. Nathaniel understood, just as he understood that Eli wasn't talking only about himself. As evening fell, Eli took the train downtown, to a small shelter that had once been his safe haven. He wasn't scheduled to speak. He wasn't expected. But he had a habit now of returning without fanfare, sitting in the back of the room while meals were served, talking one-on-one with kids who didn't know his story, who saw only a man who listened. That night, a girl named Naomi, maybe 13, sat beside him and asked, "Is it true you used to live outside?" Eli nodded. She picked at her food for a moment. "Was it scary?" "Sometimes," he said. "But you don't look scared now." Eli looked at her. "Neither do you." Naomi smiled for the first time. And in that moment, the city itself seemed to slow, just enough to hear.